William Shirley was a British colonial administrator who was the longest-serving governor of the province of Massachusetts Bay and then governor of the Bahamas. He is best known for his role in organizing the 1745 Siege of Louisbourg during King George's War, and for his role in military affairs during the French and Indian War. He spent most of his years in the colonial administration of North America working to defeat New France. But his lack of formal military training led to political difficulties and his eventual downfall. Politically well-connected, Shirley began his career in Massachusetts as Advocate General in the Admiralty Court, and quickly became an opponent of Governor Jonathan Belcher. He joined with Belcher's other political enemies to bring about Belcher's recall, and was appointed governor of Massachusetts Bay in Belcher's place. He successfully quieted political divisions within the province, and was able to bring about united action against New France when King George's War began in 1744. The successful Siege of Louisbourg, which Shirley had a major role in organizing, was one of the high points of his administration. After King George's War, Shirley became mired in disputes over funding and accounting for the war effort, and returned to England in 1749 to deal with political and legal matters arising from those disputes. He was then assigned to a commission established by Great Britain and France to determine the colonial borders in North America. His hardline approach to these negotiations contributed to the failure, and he returned to Massachusetts in 1753. Military matters again dominated Shirley's remaining years in Massachusetts, with the French and Indian War beginning in 1754. Shirley led a military expedition to reinforce Fort Oswego in 1755, and became Commander-in-Chief, North America, upon the death of General Edward Braddock. His difficulties in organizing expeditions in 1755 and 1756 were compounded by political disputes with New York politicians, and over military matters with Indian agent Sir William Johnson. These disagreements led to his recall in 1757 as both Commander-in-Chief and as Governor. In his later years he served as Governor of the Bahamas before returning to Massachusetts, where he died. Early life. William Shirley, the son of William and Elizabeth Godwin Shirley, was born on the 2nd of December 1694 at Preston Manor in East Sussex, England. He was educated at Pembroke College, Cambridge, and then read law at the Inner Temple in London. In 1717 his grandfather died, leaving him a hall in Wivelsfield and some funds, which he used to purchase a clerkship in London. About the same time he married Frances Barker, with whom he had a large number of children. He was called to the bar in 1720. Although his inheritance had been substantial, he cultivated an expensive lifestyle, and suffered significant financial reverses in the Depression of 1721. The financial demands of his large family prompted him to seek an appointment in the North American colonies. His family was connected by marriage to the Duke of Newcastle, who became an important patron and sponsor of Shirley's advancement, and to that of Arthur Onslow, the Speaker of the House of Commons. Armed with letters of introduction from Newcastle and others, Shirley arrived in Boston, Massachusetts in 1731. Advocate General, Shirley was initially received with indifference by Massachusetts Governor Jonathan Belcher, who refused him patronage positions that became available. In 1733 Shirley sought to secure from David Dunbar the commission as the Crown Surveyor General, but Dunbar eventually decided to retain the office. Influence from Newcastle eventually yielded Shirley a position as Advocate General in the Admiralty Court. Belcher resisted requested further entreaties from Newcastle to promote Shirley, and Shirley began using his position to actively prosecute Belcher supporters whose illegal logging activities came under his jurisdiction. Shirley also made common cause with Samuel Waldo, a wealthy merchant and major landowner in the province's Eastern District, where Belcher's lax enforcement of timber-cutting laws was harming his business with the Royal Navy. In 1736, Shirley sent his wife to London to lobby on his behalf against Belcher. Waldo also eventually went to London. The combination of Shirley's connection to Newcastle and Waldo's money soon made inroads in the colonial administration. When these were joined by discontented New Hampshire interests, a full-scale offensive was launched in the late 1730s to unseat Belcher. This included at least one forged letter on the part of Belcher opponents in an attempt to discredit the governor, which Shirley denounced. By 1738, Newcastle was in a dominant position in not just the colonial administration, but also in the British government as an opponent of Prime Minister Sir Robert Walpole, and he actively encouraged Belcher's opponents. In 1739, the Privy Council reprimanded Belcher, voted to separate the Massachusetts and New Hampshire governorships, and began debating the idea of replacing the governor. The exact reasons for Belcher's dismissal have been a recurring subject of scholarly interest, due to the many colonial, imperial, and political factors at play. Two principal themes within these analyses are Belcher's acquisition of many local enemies, and the idea that good imperial governance in London eventually required his replacement. Before the issues of 1739, most of the efforts to unseat Belcher had failed. Belcher himself noted in that year that the war worm in Gagden is carrying on in much the same manner as for 9 years past. Historian Stephen Foster further notes that someone as powerful as Newcastle was at the time generally had much weightier issues to deal with than arbitrating colonial politics. In this instance, however, imperial and colonial considerations coincided over the need for Massachusetts to provide a significant number of troops for Newcastle's proposed West Indies expedition in the War of Jenkins' Year. In April 1740, Newcastle in effect offered Shirley the opportunity to prove, in the light of Belcher's political difficulties, that he could more effectively raise troops than the governor could. Shirley consequently engaged in recruiting, principally outside Massachusetts, and deluged Newcastle with documentation of his successes while Belcher was preoccupied with a banking crisis. Newcastle handed the issue off to Martin Bladen, secretary to the Board of Trade and a known Belcher opponent. The Board of Trade then apparently decided, based on the weight of the extant evidence, that Belcher needed to be replaced. In April 1741, the Privy Council approved William Shirley's commission as governor of Massachusetts, and Benning Wentworth's commission as governor of New Hampshire was issued the following June. Governor of Massachusetts. When Shirley assumed the governorship of Massachusetts in August 1741, he was immediately confronted with a currency crisis. The province had been suffering for many years with inflation caused by issuance of increasing quantities of paper currency. Late in Belcher's tenure, competing banking proposals had been made in a bid to address the issue, and a popular proposal for a bank secured by real estate had been enacted. This bank had been dissolved by an act of Parliament, and Shirley had to negotiate the dissolution of the bank's assets and reclamation of the notes it had issued. In this process, which occupied the rest of 1741, Shirley deftly navigated legislation through the provincial assembly that provided a schedule for redeeming the bank's currency without causing the bank's principal owners to collapse under a deluge of redemptions. With rising tensions, Shirley acted to strengthen the military defenses of the colony. He created a series of volunteer militia companies along the frontier. These included Burke's Ranges and Gorham's Ranges, which became the model for Shirley's more famous creation, Rogers Ranges. Outbreak of War. Britain captured Acadia from France in Queen Anne's War, but the Treaty of Utrecht left Cape Breton Island in French hands, and did not clearly demarcate a boundary between New France and the British colonies on the Atlantic coast. To protect the crucial passageway of the St. Lawrence River into the heart of New France, France built a strong fortress at Louisbourg on the Atlantic coast of Cape Breton Island. When Shirley took office, relations between France and Britain were strained, and there was a possibility that Britain would be drawn into the War of the Austrian Succession, which had started on the European mainland in 1740. Shirley was able to finesse his restrictions on the production of paper currency to achieve an updating of the province's defences, and in 1742 requested permission from the Board of Trade for the printing of additional currency should war break out. This permission was granted in 1743, along with a warning that war with France was likely. France declared war against Britain in March 1744, and forces from Louisbourg raided the British fishing port of Canso on the northern end of mainland Nova Scotia before its residents were aware they were at war. French privateers also began preying on British and colonial vessels. British colonial governors along the coast, including Shirley, sent colonial guard ships and authorized their own privateers in response, neutralizing the French activity. Canso was used by New England fishermen, and as such its fall was of interest to Massachusetts. Shirley had, prior to its capture, received a request for assistance from the Lieutenant Governor of Nova Scotia, Paul Mascarene, for support in the defense of Annapolis Royal. In response to the fall of Canso and a second urgent request from Mascarene, Shirley promptly dispatched 2 companies of volunteers to Annapolis Royal. The timely arrival of these troops in early July broke up a siege. John Bradstreet, who had been captured at Canso and held prisoner at Louisbourg, returned to New England in a prisoner exchange, and gave a detailed report to Shirley that emphasized the weaknesses of the French fort. William Vaughan, who owned several businesses in Maine that were vulnerable to raids from New France, toured New England advocating an expedition to capture Louisbourg. Shirley and other leaders in New England and New York sent letters to colonial authorities in London seeking support for such an expedition, citing the vulnerable conditions at Louisbourg. Vaughan and Bradstreet wanted to attack Louisbourg that winter with an all-colonial force. Shirley doubted the practicality of that plan, but in January 1745 submitted it to the Provincial Assembly, which declined to support the plan, but did request that Britain undertake an attack on Louisbourg. Vaughan continued to advocate for a quick all-American expedition, enlisting the support of fishing captains, merchants and 200 principal gentlemen of Boston. Shirley called the General Court into session to discuss the matter once more, and the proposal was submitted to a committee chaired by William Pepperell. The committee reported favorably on the plan, and it was approved by a single vote when several opponents were absent from the chamber. Shirley appointed a reluctant William Pepperell to command the expedition. William Vaughan was appointed colonel, but without a command position, and John Bradstreet was appointed as a military advisor to Pepperell. Shirley requested support for the expedition from Peter Warren, Commodore of the Royal Navy Squadron in the West Indies, but Warren declined due to the strenuous objections of his captains. This news arrived in Boston just as the expedition was preparing to leave. Despite the absence of support from the Royal Navy, the New England expedition set out in March 1745 for Louisbourg. More than 4,000 men on more than 90 transports, escorted by 6 colonial guard ships, descended on Canseau, where the expedition waited for the ice to clear from Gabrus Bay, the site just south of Louisbourg that had been chosen for the troop landing. Starting on the 22nd of April, the expedition was joined by 4 Royal Navy warships under the command of Commodore Warren, who received orders to assist the expedition. Siege of Louisbourg. The provincial forces began landing at Gabrus Bay on the 30th of April, and laid siege to the fortress while the British ships blockaded the harbour. The Americans began suffering battle losses, while the British naval officers, who had a low opinion of American soldiers, grew increasingly critical of the American efforts. Warren tried to exert control over the provincial troops, but Pepperell resisted him. Louisbourg surrendered on the 17th of June. The Americans lost 180 men in combat, to disease or at sea during the siege, while the Royal Navy ships did not fire on the fortress, and lost just 1 sailor. As the victors settled into occupation of Louisbourg, friction grew between the Americans and the British. The terms of surrender guaranteed the French in all of the possessions. There was no plunder for the American troops. On the other hand, the Royal Navy had captured several rich French prizes, and British sailors on shore leave bragged to the Americans about how rich they were going to be from the shares. The American troops had signed up to capture Louisbourg, and expected to go home after siege ended. The British government, who had believed that the provincial troops were incapable of capturing Louisbourg on their own, had made no plans to send British troops to take over occupation of the fortress. When it became evident that British troops would not be relieving the provincials until after winter had passed, Governor Shirley traveled to Louisbourg to raise the morale of the troops. His first speech to the troops had little effect, and some troops were close to mutiny. In a second speech, Shirley promised to send home more troops immediately, and provide higher pay and better supplies for those who stayed until spring. Honours from the British government were sparse. Pepperell was made a baronet. He and Shirley were made colonels in the British Army with the right to raise their own regiments, and Warren was promoted to rear admiral. Aborted Campaign. Shirley had engaged in the Louisbourg campaign primarily as a way to ensure British interests in the Atlantic fisheries. The victory, however, made him expand his vision to encompass the possibility of capturing all of New France. After capturing the French fort, he wrote to Newcastle, proposing a series of expeditions to gain control of all of North America as far west as the Mississippi River, starting with one that would go up the St. Lawrence from Louisbourg. Upon his return to Boston, Shirley began making preparations for such an expedition. In May 1746 he received plans for London outlining an attempt on Quebec using Royal Navy and provincial forces, while a second expedition was to attack Fort St. Frederick on Lake Champlain. Shirley stepped up recruiting in Massachusetts and asked neighboring governors to contribute men and resources to the effort. Expected support from Britain never arrived, however, and the 1746 expeditions were called off. While waiting for definite word from London of plans for 1747, Shirley beefed up the province's western defences, and in the spring of 1747 he began sending supplies to the Hudson River Valley in anticipation of a move toward Fort St. Frederick. Word then arrived from Newcastle that the British establishment would not support any expeditions against New France. The drop in military spending that resulted had negative consequences on the Massachusetts economy, harming Shirley's popularity. Shirley personally profited from the supply activities surrounding the Louisbourg expedition. In 1746 he used the funds to purchase an estate in Roxbury, on which he built an elaborate mansion, now known as the Shirley Eustace House. Before the building was complete, his wife died of a fever in August 1746. She was interred in King's Chapel. Impressment crisis. While Governor Shirley was at Louisbourg, trouble had been brewing between the Royal Navy and the people of Boston. The Navy had long sought to press Americans into service on its ships. Impressment was a long-standing practice in Britain, but its application in America was resisted by the colonists. In 1702, Fort William on Castle Island had fired on HMS Swift as it tried to leave Boston Harbor with 6 recently impressed men aboard. As a result of American complaints, Parliament in 1708 banned impressment in the American colonies. Navy leaders argued that the American exemption from impressment had been in force only during Queen Anne's War, which ended in 1713. In practice, Royal Navy captains had to apply to colonial governors for a license to press men. In late November 1745, a fight between a press gang and some sailors staying in a boarding house in Boston left 2 of the sailors with fatal injuries. 2 members of the press gang were charged with murder and convicted, but were released when the indictment was found invalid. 2 years later, Commodore Charles Knowles, who served as governor of Louisbourg after its capture, had a large number of seamen from Boston Harbor impressed for service in his squadron. A mob of more than 300 men seized 3 naval officers and a deputy sheriff and beat the sheriff. The mob then went to Governor Shirley's house, demanding the release of the men impressed by Knowles. Shirley tried to call out the militia, but they did not respond. Shirley did succeed in getting the naval officers into his house, and the mob eventually left. Later in the day, Shirley went to the townhouse to meet the people. The mob, now consisting of several thousand people, attacked the townhouse, breaking many windows in the building. Shirley spoke to the mob and promised to present the demands to Commodore Knowles. The mob left, intending to find a Royal Navy ship to burn. After Shirley had returned home that afternoon, the mob, which had seized another naval officer and several petty officers, returned to his house. Shirley ordered a number of armed men who were protecting his house to fire at the mob, but William Pepperell was able to stop Shirley's men from firing and to persuade the mob to leave. In the meantime, Commodore Knowles threatened to bombard Boston with his squadron. It was only after the Massachusetts Council adopted resolutions in support of the demands of the mob that the situation became quieter in Boston. The mob eventually released its hostages and Knowles released the impressed seamen. Compensation and currency. Another issue of contention was compensation to the American colonies by Britain for the costs of the expedition against Louisbourg and the long occupation by American troops until the British Army finally took over. This presented Shirley with a problem, because the expedition's leaders, including his former ally Samuel Waldo, grossly inflated the claimed costs. Waldo used Shirley's unwillingness to openly act against him to begin his own efforts to topple the governor. Shirley was only able to forestall this effort by promising the colonial administration that he would achieve financial stability in the province by retiring its paper currency. The British government was also slow in responding to requests for compensation. While waiting for a response, the question of how to use any compensation was debated in provincial newspapers and pamphlets. Some, such as Samuel Adams, advocated placing the money in London banks to serve as backing for the paper currency issued by the colonies. Others, including William Douglas and Thomas Hutchinson, Speaker of the General Court, favored using the compensation to redeem the paper currency and give Massachusetts a hard currency. In 1748, the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle returned Louisbourg to France, with Massachusetts still awaiting compensation for its seizure. In the meantime, Governor Shirley had been trying to finance a campaign to capture Fort St. Frederick, for which he issued more paper money. The campaign was abandoned when the colonies failed to support it, but the resulting inflation helped turn supporters of Shirley against him. The loss of Louisbourg increased public dissatisfaction with Shirley, who was seen as complicit in British scheming against the American colonies. Even William Pepperell joined the large number of citizens calling for Shirley's removal. Samuel Adams edited and Gamaliel Rogers and Daniel Fowle published the Independent Advertiser, which regularly criticized the British government and Shirley's administration. The paper published several of Shirley's letters to officials in Britain that were critical of Americans, and regularly called for the governor's removal. William Douglas, a prominent physician in Boston, wrote a series of pamphlets attacking Shirley, Commodore Knowles, and the whole conduct of the campaign for Louisbourg and its occupation. Both Shirley and Knowles sued Douglas for libel, but lost their cases in court. Shirley's conflict with Samuel Waldo over expenses eventually reached a high pitch. Shirley had successfully attached some of Waldo's assets in legal action, which Waldo had countered with further legal action. Shirley appealed these actions to London, and was granted permission to travel to London to deal with the matter. He sailed for Britain in September 1749, just before the long-promised compensation reached Boston. Under legislation shepherded by Thomas Hutchinson, the specie delivered was used to retire the paper currency. While Shirley was abroad, Hutchinson, Andrew Oliver, and others served as his surrogates, and he carefully instructed Lieutenant Governor Spencer Phipps to not give his enemies opportunities to maneuver in his absence.